Welcome back, everybody. I'm Giles, and oh my goodness, we have got a show for you today. So, you guys might have heard of this company called Trinnov, and they make these really awesome processors, and they do all kinds of stuff in the AV world, for everything from theater to pro audio, all kinds of stuff. Well, they have this new thing coming out, and I'm not going to say the name of it. I'm going to let my esteemed guest here, John Heron, tell us all about it. But I've got the goosebumps, and this is really, really cool stuff because this really speaks to technology and hobbies that I really enjoy. And I think it's going to speak to you as well. But first, John, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, and I'll be doing even better after CD is over with, because
And
we're
we
all a
will
little bit
talk.
sleep deprived currently.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Oh
we'll
yeah,
talk about Cedia too, because
yeah.
for those that are in the industry and will be at the trade show, they're going to be able to experience this firsthand, because not a lot of people, I think, have really had an opportunity. If you weren't out at ISC or have some insider info, or maybe a first adopter kind of situation for a dealer. But John, maybe you could tell everybody briefly who you are, a little bit about Trinoff, and then you can open up the conversation around this new technology.
Well, my name's John Heron. I am. I know this sounds odd, but I'm actually one of two general managers for Trinnov Audio Inc., which is basically Trinnov USA. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of the French company.
Hmm.
And Trinnov was founded 20 years ago this year, where they were incorporated. They actually had started doing some of the basic research before they incorporated, but um, it was originally founded to do fundamental research of the type that you would normally expect to see at a major university, but specifically into the way we human beings perceive 3D sound fields. So the founders were very interested in that, coming straight out of grad school, and we've been kind of working on it ever since. And a number, it's sort of like the space program. They spend gazillion dollars and send a man to the moon, and we get Tang, right? So,
Right.
but there are some, and ballpoint pens and a bunch of things, but there are spin-off benefits, and in this case, some of the spin-off benefits are pretty huge. Things like our optimizer technology, um, and we started a different research project not quite 7 years ago now, um, to just find out if there was something that could be done to not merely mitigate, but to solve the problem of bass reproduction in small rooms, which by small rooms, we're just talking things that you might have in your home as
Right.
opposed to
Not an
major auditoriums.
auditorium, or right.
Right,
Gotcha.
right. Because everything until now, which everything's been done to now, is perfectly valid, but it's all kind of aimed at mitigating an intractable problem. And we started years ago to see, well, can we actually eliminate the problem rather than just mitigating it? And we didn't know whether we'd be able to actually do anything. That's the nature of basic research. But we're ready to, at least start sharing some of the results with people. And we're calling it waveforming.
That's awesome. Yeah, we have some folks in the crowd already that are they are queued up, and they're like, I am ready for this. And this is Kevin Sorkin. He runs GSG Audio, and they produce subwoofers. So this I think this episode is tailored just for you, Kevin. Um,
Yeah, we've had a lot of interest from subwoofer companies
yeah,
because we will, I mean, we'll almost certainly help the subwoofer companies sell more product as a result of this, but we can get into that.
absolutely. So the technology that we're talking about is called waveforming,
Hmm.
and at a high level, so let's kind of define this at a high level. At a high level, this is a strategy and technology that Chernoff has designed, pioneered, and developed. And the goal is to find a way, or you've created a way that people can deal with all of the issues with base management. And what I mean by that is, room modes and all of the other ancillary
Right.
items that cause degradation in the quality of base response. So I think you could describe it better than me, but is that kind of the general idea?
Yeah, the only thing I would change is that too often people hear the word space management and they immediately think of the active crossover that,
Right, right.
redirects space from one speaker to the subwoofer or whatever. And that's really not what we're talking. I mean, that's involved, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're, in the sense that you just described, we're trying to manage the way bass is reproduced in the room so that you can hear it more clearly and with a greater sense of the dynamics that are actually in the recording. Because we're looking to get rid of the mud that is caused by bass just bouncing around in the room for 5 or 10 times as long as mids and highs do.
So you're telling me that there's a better way than just coating everything with bass traps.
Yeah. Um, a traditional passive bass trap needs to be tuned to a very specific frequency. So broadband, it doesn't do a lot for you. You know, it might take out one or two nasty peaks in your room if you do everything right. And there are some active absorbing technology, like Bag End introduced an active, microphone, and it looked like a subwoofer, but it was designed to absorb bass
Mhm.
rather than to emit it. And that's, I don't remember exactly, but that was back in the early 2000s. So some of these ideas have been around for quite a while. What waveforming does is it brings a great deal of sophistication and intelligence to the algorithm that figures out what to do with all of this fancy technology.
Great. Well, let's get into it then. And if you want, we can do slides or however you think it's best to present. What would you like?
Um, just because it's kind of new and there are definitely some misconceptions about it out there. I probably be good to have a few visual aids, but
Yeah,
I'd like to keep
good.
that to a minimum and really open it up to Q&A as quickly as possible.
Absolutely.
Um, so,
And so everybody out there, um, go ahead and feel free to drop questions into the comments as we go along,
mm,
and I can pull those up through the as it's appropriate. We don't have a lot of time, so I want to make sure that the juicy ones get addressed at least. So, all
okay.
right, John, let's move forward.
Yeah. So, as I was just sort of alluding to, the idea of using microphones and speakers together to actively absorb excess space in the room has been around for quite a while. I mentioned Bag N. But one problem with this approach is that it struggles with just the sheer number of reflections that are bouncing around helter skelter in the room. It's possible to use multiple controllers or absorbers, like multiple bag ends or whatever, at low frequencies to try to absorb more reflected energy. But it's really difficult when the bass is just sprayed around the room every which way. I mean, I'm sure all of your viewers have heard that bass is omnidirectional, and under normal circumstances, it is because even a really big woofer is quite a bit smaller than the waves it's producing, and so it's like dropping a pebble into a pond. The the bass just goes in every direction. Um, but the all of the reflected energy from those absorbers that is not perfect actually creates another, well, excuse me, all the reflected energy that is not absorbed creates the problem of room modes or standing waves, which two ways of saying the same thing. And they're caused by reflections within the room that are interfering with, if you will, the original sound or the direct sound that's coming from the speaker, and also with other reflections that have been bouncing around for a while. So, some of the problems are wide variations from one seat to the next in terms of, what you can hear and what you can't hear. Um, and even frequencies that aren't actually canceled in, if you're sitting in the null of a room mode, all that bass energy bouncing around for, like I said, 5 or 10 times as long as what happens in the mids and the highs, it tends to obscure a lot of dynamic contrasts and detail. All that stuff just gets lost in the mud. Um, so it's really hard to get consistent, high quality sound quality at these frequencies at more than maybe just one or two seats in the room.
Right,
And
and
we'd
that's the
like
problem
to
that I've
spread it
always had.
around.
Yeah, that's what I've
Yeah.
always had a problem with. You can make it sound really nice for maybe 2 spots, and, if you're doing 2 rows in your theater, maybe 6 seats or something, it gets really difficult. At anything larger than that,
Yeah.
I can't even imagine how anybody would create a consistent experience. Yeah, that's great.
Well, and I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but at Stadia, are the results of RP22 recommended practices. It's how to get great sound in your home. There's a thick book. Peter Eilert deserves to be sainted for the amount of work he put into that program. But I was on it along with a bunch of other industry people, and it talks about 4 levels of performance, which is basically good, better, best, and cost no object. And that level 4 cost no object thing, even there, the standard is you have to be within 2 dB, plus minus 2 dB of whatever your target curve is
Hmm.
in at least one seat plus one adjacent seat in the room. So no matter how big the room is, you have to have at least two seats that are really good. And that's the cost no object one. We'll see if we get to the results. We can typically meet that standard for every seat in the room,
Wow.
which has never been done before.
That I can't even imagine. That is super exciting.
So just another way of visualizing what's happening. The blue arrows indicate the initial sound that's being radiated from, in this case, the subwoofer that's in the front of the room. And then the red arrows indicate efforts at absorbing the sound that reaches the various locations around the room. Part of the problem is that the wavefronts are different shapes. Like it's a really small radius when it just leaves the subwoofer, but by the time it gets to the other end of the room, what reaches the other end of the room is fairly flat. So if you're trying
Mhm.
to absorb that with what is, again, something that's really close to the driver and therefore has a small radius, it doesn't work perfectly. An easier way of visualizing this is to say that, um, in this case, we've got three subs in the front of the room, and they're positioned in an unusual way, but they're all just kind of spraying sound into the room, and it's causing a bunch of reflections. Um, what we're doing is with waveforming, we're using those multiple subwoofers, which admittedly have to be placed, in certain ways. You can't just put them anywhere to
Right.
produce a nice clean wavefront that propagates through the room with minimal reflections from the side walls, the floor, and the ceiling. And that way, you only have to really absorb the one thing that reaches the rear wall of the room. And there are subs back there that are trying to do that. Another difference between what we're doing with waveforming and what some of your viewers may know as a double bass array is that all of our speakers can be used to absorb the sound. And that's conveyed a little bit in a little bit more clearly in this animation where, the sound goes from the front of the room to the back of the room. Most of it gets absorbed, but you can see there's like a little bit still left,
Mhm.
and that gets absorbed when it hits the front of the room. So the idea is rather than dealing with a cacophony of bass that's just bouncing around and causing standing waves and having a very long decay time that obscures a lot of detail and so forth, we're trying to make sure that you only hear the bass once, like as it's passing you, the way it would if you were outdoors. It's going to go
Absolutely.
past you and just keep going. Um, and it turns out that that reveals a tremendous amount of clarity and detail. The only time I've heard a really great outdoor system was years and years ago at a party at Keith Yates' house, and I was
It would be a
it was
Keith's
in his
house.
backyard, and it was a really nice. This was a Danley system, and I was shocked because it was as good as, well, it was better than most of the home stereos I had heard. Um, and a lot of that was that, you didn't have the room polluting the sound.
Sure, yeah.
So this is probably not worth getting into, so I'll skip over it. If people are interested, they can ask questions. But one little side note, if anybody in the audience is an integrator, um, all too often we run into situations where um, the home theater is the owner of the home wants the home theater done even though the network isn't done yet, which makes doing anything on the cloud impossible. The good news for an integrator is that this is all self-contained in the altitude, because we have a significant amount of computational power there. We can just do it locally. But this is called a heat map, sometimes wavelet analysis. And the idea is showing, that at low frequencies, because at the top here, I think it goes up, it stops at about 400 hertz. But
Mhm.
at low frequencies, you can see, the horizontal axis is time, vertical is from like 0 to 400 hertz. And how loud it is displayed by that little rainbow kind of thing. So red is a lot louder than blue. Um, so you can see before and after, the bass is kind of bouncing around for a while. And then with waveforming, it's still, it's not perfect, but it's a small fraction of what it is otherwise. And in fact, even your high frequencies will bounce around a little bit. The goal is to try and make it consistent across all the frequencies. Um, Another way of looking at it is just that spatial deviation that I was talking about earlier with RP22. These are actual measurements that we took in a room before and after waveforming. And the vertical scale, so you can, if it's too small to see, wherever you see a number is, like from 0 to 10 to 20. So it's 10 dB steps. And there are, 15, 20 dB differences are very common at these frequencies from just one location in the room to the next. And we
That's
can squeeze that down
exceptional.
to, we can squeeze it down to almost nothing.
Yeah,
A lot
that
of
is
consistency.
crazy. Wow.
So you don't necessarily have to take my word for it. I'm not going to read these things to you. Your readers are, your viewers are perfectly capable of reading on their own. But these are some of the reactions that we got from folks at Barcelona at Integrated Systems Europe, which is where we showed waveforming the first time back in February. And a number of, we were talking just before we went on the air, there are a number of speaker companies that have already changed their demo rooms and training facilities to take advantage of
Mhm.
this because they think it's such a dramatic difference. So I think I have.
One
Mhm.
impact of this would seem to be, and I've got a bunch of questions that are lined up,
Good.
but it looks like the general design philosophy of this is you have all of your primary bass reproduction in the front of the room, then you have a set of speakers in the rear of the room that function to implement the waveforming, right? And of course, it's active on both.
Actually,
But
let me stop
yeah,
you
please
there.
do.
The waveforming name actually comes from what we're doing at the front of the room. We're using a phased array technology, or sometimes called beam steering, to make sure that the bass is concentrated where we want it and kept away from the places where it's just going to cause trouble. Um, so what we've learned in the last 6 months or so is actually the emitters, the ones
Mhm.
that are making the bass in the first place. The emitters are actually more important than the absorbers because it turns out that if you have better control over where the bass is going, it's much easier to absorb effectively. So, if, for example, if you have a kind of a normal sized room and you've decided you can manage to do 6 subwoofers rather than doing 3 and 3, we're learning that it's usually better to do 4 and 2, where the 4 in the front, so we have better control over both vertically and horizontally, kind of where that sound goes, and then a couple at the back to do the absorbing.
That's yeah. And then I guess if you extend that out through the thought process around placement, this philosophy eliminates speakers in odd locations, on the sides, under seats, in the ceiling, that kind of thing. Is that true?
Well, I mean, if you want to have butt kickers or something, there's nothing that says you can't do that. But that's sort of a whole separate feature of your theater. Yeah, the idea here, instead of just plopping subs in the corners of the room, we are taking advantage of physics as well as fancy algorithms to make sure that we can actually tell those great big long waves where to go. The multiple subwoofers are working together as a team to sort of force the bass to go where we want it and to keep it away from parts of the room where it's only going to cause trouble.
Okay, great. All right, and I think this slide answers my question. I was gonna say, are there more slides, or are we into
Nope.
the Q&A? Okay. All right, so I've got a bunch of questions lined up here, and the first question, which is a consolidation of a number of questions that have come across, is, um, if someone wants to implement waveforming in their environment, what are the bits and pieces that they need at a minimum level to get started, right? So, I would assume that's a Trinnov a platform of some kind, Altitude 16 or whatnot. But what
Yeah.
are the bits and pieces?
Well, an altitude processor, certainly. You'll need at a minimum 4 subwoofers, which is not that uncommon nowadays. Because if you put 2 subwoofers in the front wall and 2 subwoofers in the back wall, and it's not a huge room, so the walls aren't actually that big. You put them halfway up between the floor and the ceiling, and a quarter of the way in from the sidewalls, and we can get into why that placement or something close to it is useful. But with that unusual placement, we actually can do a pretty good job of the beam steering that I was talking about earlier. And of course, as you might imagine, with larger rooms, you need more subs. Um, and the other thing that might cause you to go with more subs would be the fact that if you want to control, how the bass is steered, as the wavelengths get shorter because the frequency is getting higher, then the subs need to be closer and closer to each other to maintain that control. So if you want a higher range of frequencies that you're controlling really well, you'll probably need more subs. Or if you have a bigger room, you may need more subs. And if you have both, you're talking about a lot of subs potentially.
Certainly, certainly.
But we're getting really good results with like 4 and 6 subs in the kind of rooms that most people wind up listening in.
Awesome.
So
In this vein, so Ahmed, he asks, does it matter if the subwoofers are on the wall, on the floor, and can you use sealed, ported? What does it look like from acoustic suspension or bass reflex designs?
yeah, you can use either bass reflex or sealed. In general, what I'm about to say has nothing to do with waveforming, but in general, um, I'd recommend having subwoofers handling the same frequencies, some of which are sealed and some of which are ported, just because they have a very different time domain characteristics. And
Hmm.
in my experience, I've always found that really hard to make work well. Um, but either one by itself can work great. That's not a problem. And either one can work with speakers of a different type. Like if you have a vented sub, you can use acoustic suspension main speakers. That kind of thing is no
Certainly,
problem. Um,
certainly.
but it does need to be on the wall rather than on the floor, because we're actually using the reflections off the floor, ceiling, and sidewalls to create sort of virtual subwoofers. Um, if you think about a subwoofer that is, I don't know, in the middle of a wall, you hear the sound coming directly from the subwoofer. But some of the sound goes off in one direction, off to the side. I'm trying to see where you can see my hand.
Right.
Some of
They go
the bass is bouncing off the sidewall and then reaches you off, the reflection reaches you. And just like a mirror, if you were to put a mirror on the wall, you could see an image of the subwoofer in the mirror. There is an acoustic image of that subwoofer that sounds like it's behind the actual physical wall. It's just like mirrors and light. It's in this case it's sound and a hard wall. But we're using those sort of reflected or virtual subwoofers, if you will, to help control the shape of that wave. So another thing that helps is if you have relatively solid walls. If you have really flimsy walls, those reflections aren't as good because the bass just goes on through the walls rather than being kept in the room. So you need a Trinnov, an altitude processor. At least for a little while, you'll probably need some input from us because we've not had time to train our dealers and distributors in depth on this.
mhm.
So it's going to take us a little while to ramp up. But typically 4 or 6 or more, depending on the scope of the project, subwoofers. That's about it, and
So,
our
and then
help.
just for my edification here. So, when you say subs, obviously, that's open to a lot of interpretation around sizing. But if you take a typical room that might be, I don't know, 14 or 15 foot wide and maybe 20, 25 feet deep,
Hmm.
something like, maybe it's got 2 rows of 3 seats, something like that,
Yeah,
which I think is probably kind of a good size for your home theater,
yeah,
enthusiasts that are really into it, right? But it's not, I'm going to spend 5 million bucks or something.
yeah, right.
Are we talking like 4 18-inch subs kind of behind the screen in the center and then a couple in the back, or can you get away with 15s, or would you rather go with 612s, or does it matter so much?
Well, it does matter a little bit, and the reason is actually it makes sense if you think about it. One of the goals of waveforming is to make sure that you hear the sound that's coming directly at you from the speaker, in this case in the front walls. But then you're not hearing all of the energy that would otherwise be bouncing around for, maybe half a second or something like that. So you're only hearing the sound once instead of dozens of times, right?
Mhm.
So typically you would probably want to go with subwoofers that have more output capability just to have the same subjective, oomph in the room. Um, because you're the same thing that is cleaning up the sound and revealing all of that detail and all of those dynamic contrasts is also getting rid of the mud in the room that lets you hear it is also bass energy that you would normally hear. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin. So you might want somewhat bigger subs than you would otherwise be able
Something
to
with
get
some
away with.
horsepower. Sure.
Um,
Yeah. So Kevin, he comments that they're working on a theater that will have 421s in the front and 2 in the back, and it'll leverage your technology. So that's very exciting, Kevin. I would love to see photos as that build comes along, and love to tell people that story. That's exciting. Um, and then I guess for clarification, this is a front push and rear pull configuration is the question?
yeah, it's not quite that simple, but a traditional DBA or double bass array. The idea is that, if this side of the room is the front, this side of the room is the back, um, the bass gets pushed out of the front and it forms because there are a bunch of subwoofers that are positioned very carefully with respect to one another. It forms kind of a flat wave instead of a big spherical wave. It's a relatively flat wave that travels the length of the room, and then the subs in the back of the room in a double bass array are playing the exact same signal that the front ones had played, except it's inverted and
Mhm.
it's delayed by the amount of time it takes the sound to reach the back wall, right? So it's a pretty simple thing. All the subs in the front are getting the exact same signal. All the subs in the back are getting the exact same signal, except it's been inverted and delayed. And so it's sort of a pitch and catch kind of thing, right?
Right.
If everything is perfect, it works pretty well, but we live in the real world and perfection is just not part of the not part of the story.
Certainly.
If you have even so much as a single riser because of your 2 rows of 3 seats, now you have furniture, you've got seats at different levels, you have the riser itself, the rear wall is now smaller, shorter than the front wall, right? um, and there's probably other stuff going on in the room. The problem with a double bass array is that what reaches the wall is usually not what left the front wall, right?
Mhm.
Along the way, it's been changed, but to the degree that it is now different, the rear wall can't absorb it. So not only is it ineffective at absorbing that sound, it's also actually pumping new kind of extraneous sound into the room that was there to try to absorb something, but it's not absorbing anything. So
That
now
makes
you've
a
got
lot of
this
sense.
spurious stuff bouncing around. Waveforming, if the highest and best implementation of waveforming will always have some superficial resemblance to a double bass array because it's physics. It's, there's no cheating, no getting around that. But with the research we've done with beamforming and in our world, each subwoofer will have its own unique input. Um, and that's how you can actually steer things. If you want something to go up, you give the bottom subs a little bit of a head start before you fire the top subs, and that creates a wave that goes up, um, as an example. Um, the beamforming thing requires a lot more computational power, but it also makes it easier to deal with the real world, like a lot easier. Um, as I was saying before we got online, I was speaking with a very accomplished acoustic designer who also does a lot of calibrations. And he had been involved in about a dozen double bass arrays, traditional,
Right.
old school double bass arrays. And when I started talking to him about waveforming to give him a little sneak preview, um, his initial reaction was, "Oh God, if I never have to do another double bass array, I'll die a happy man," because it was just so difficult. It seems so simple. It seems like it should work, but it's so difficult to get to work in practice. I'm not saying that this is simple. It does involve taking quite a lot of measurements. We do three-dimensional measurements throughout the listening area in a three-dimensional grid. So if you
Mhm.
imagine the jungle gyms that some of us played on when we were little kids, you put a microphone at each one of those little intersections, and you measure exactly what's going on horizontally, vertically, you name it, throughout the listening area. And that is in part so that we can tell exactly how the wavefront is changed by the stuff in the room, so that we can do a better job of absorbing what actually reaches the back wall. The other
And
difference is that all of our subs are absorbers. Anything that's
right.
left over can be absorbed by the front wall subs.
So yeah, so this comment that came across earlier. So Ahmed said he bought a Trinnov 32 specifically for double bass. Well, sounds like he's going to have a treat because he'll have access to this technology,
Yeah,
which will be superior to that. But the good part is that his concept of placement is going to be, for the most part, correct. So it'll be not as difficult of a transition between the two. Now, another thing that comes to mind as we've talked through these things, when we think about equipment and having the right equipment for your room, this is going to eat up a lot of channels on a processor
yeah.
because you're going to need individual channels for each subwoofer. So if you're doing a 9 bed channel, 6 Atmos, that's 15. And then you need another 6 channels probably. So you're up to 21 channels. So, altitude 16, is it
I
possible to do this?
Well, the Altitude 16 with our +4 software that we released a couple of
All
years ago
right. Takes you
now,
up to 20.
it
That's right. Yep.
actually can do 20 channels of decoding and rendering, processing, you name it. So you could do a 9.6.4 system that works up to 19. If you wanted to do 9.6.6, you're right, that's past 20. So, there may be some trade-offs there. Um, I will say that based on my experience, I suspect the effect of waveforming for most people will be more important than that extra pair of speakers above you.
I was going to comment the same thing, not with any practical experience, but
Yeah,
that would seem to be, if you're doing altitude 16, 964 would be the way to
yeah,
go.
I
That makes,
I
and that'd
think
be
so.
4 in the front and 2 in the back, right?
Typically, yeah. Especially if you have risers, because then the back wall again is a little bit smaller, right?
Right on.
Um,
So so Kevin, you need to come out with these 6 subwoofer packages for customers to get them ready. Um,
Such a deal I've got for you. Yeah.
I know 6, and okay, we are just over time. I'm gonna put a couple more comments up. Brolic Media is with us, and he's excited for the release of Waveform. A really good guy. He's got a great business, great dealer there. So there have been a couple of questions of, is there a way that without a Trinnov platform, I can take some speakers and put in the front and put some in the back and try and kind of make this thing, a unsophisticated version of waveforming?
Sure. I
Any
mean,
thought
the
about
the
that?
double based array,
Is the
um,
way?
so double base arrays have only become, I wouldn't say popular, but at least fairly promulgated in Germany. Germany seems to be a nation of engineers. So, for whatever reason, the German market actually has quite a bit of experience with double base arrays. And so a lot of those have been upgraded to waveforming just since February. And we've had been able to get quite a lot of data from there. But for most of us, it's going to involve some uh, construction, or at the very
Right.
least hanging some probably heavy subwoofers on the wall. So you definitely want to tie into the studs and make sure that thing's not going anywhere.
Yeah, we need a
So it's a little
great
bit of work.
18-inch in wall. Somebody needs to make one if there could be such a thing.
In wall, yeah. I know of a couple of 18-inch subs that are only like 11 or 12 inches deep, which is already pretty impressive. Um,
Indeed.
but that would work. But if you wanted to go through the frustration that my aforementioned acoustic designer and calibrator went through, you could try to implement just a normal double bass array with a mini DSP.
Right on. Yeah,
Um,
and so but that answers Mike's question. So Mike Ortiz, if you're still watching, you can do double base array, which will give you some of the benefits of this technology using what looks like the gear you have now with your Denon and the mini
yeah.
DSP. So
I
that
would encourage you try not to get too discouraged if it doesn't live up to your expectations initially, because a normal double bass array is simple to understand and very hard to implement.
so from a frequency point of view, Is this what's the top end for the processing on this from a frequency point of view? Is it like the plus one channel up to 120 hertz, or you move up even higher?
We can go a little bit higher. Of course, as you go higher, the subwoofers need to be more densely packed because the wavelengths get shorter,
So
right?
so Michael or Mikhail Potter, this is for you. He's asking about the spacing of the subs.
Uh, yeah, I think I saw 1.7 meters.
Here, I'll put that back up.
Yeah.
With four subs on the front wall, do they have to be within
Uh,
1.7 meters of each other?
Well, I can. I don't have it in my head, but I have essentially a double base array calculator that I created before I had all the details on waveforming that would answer your question. I can't do the math in my head, but that sounds that
There
sounds
is a
about right.
requirement of
Yeah,
spacing as the
yeah.
frequencies move
One
up
and a
to get
half
tighter.
would probably be better than 1.7, but um, yeah. And you're talking about the acoustic centers of the drivers. Not edge to edge, but acoustic center to acoustic center. So yeah, 1.7 is probably going to work pretty well. Off the top of my head, I would guess it got up to about 80 hertz. We're shooting for 100 or 120 most of the time because, or even a little bit higher. Traditional passive acoustic treatment works really well down to maybe a couple of hundred hertz,
Mhm.
but it's really hard to go much lower than that because you just need soft, fluffy stuff that is, meters and meters thick. And I mean, who's got the space and the
Right.
patience to put up with that nonsense? Um, so you can do quite a lot with just normal absorption and diffusion down to a certain level. And ideally, waveforming would kind of reach up to that level for a nice smooth handoff. Because what you're looking for is a uniform decay time. In Barcelona, I think it was the Barcelona system. Um, the decay time at higher frequencies was about 80 to 100 milliseconds. It was right in that range. But at the low frequencies, before we turned on waveforming, it was almost 500 milliseconds. So it
Wow.
was
Yeah.
lasting about 5 times as long. And you turn on waveforming, and it went right down to about 70 or 80. So, and then that reveals a lot of, as I said before, dynamics in detail.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, we are over time, 7 minutes. So, John, thank you for
Okay.
bearing with me here. The last thought to close for everyone: if they want to hear this technology, if they're interested, there obviously will be more and more dealers with this implemented into their demo systems over time. Correct? And you are
Yeah,
actively engaged with companies right now to get that in place.
that's a big chunk of my day every day now. That and Cedia are my the
Right.
two
Or
things
sure.
I'm
And
spending
then
time on.
And then for those that are in the industry that'll be at Cedia, which are a number of you, first off, come and say hi to me, and then after that, you've got the important stuff done. You will have a full system set up. And do you have details about that you can share at this point of what that system will be comprised of, or is
I'm
that
not sure
still
if I'm
hush hush?
supposed to let the cat out of the bag,
Okay,
and
well
I
we'll
think
hold that then.
I,
But
I,
needless to say, there is a
I
system that will feature it.
well, yes, and it has quite a few subwoofers because if you're really into roller coasters and you make the pilgrimage to Disney World, it's not for the Slinky Dog roller coaster, right? You're going to do Space Mountain.
Sure.
So this is kind of a Space Mountain thing, but we are going to be showing subsets of the available subwoofers to show people, for example, what just a 3x2 configuration can do. And that 3x2 configuration also happens to be pretty asymmetrical, so not nearly
Interesting.
ideal. So we want to show people, the range of applicability, if I could say that. Applicability, yes. For some reason, my mouth, I have new lips. I'm just taking them for a test drive.
That is wonderful. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. It is always a pleasure to have you on, and I know I speak for everybody that's watching, and there are a bunch of you out there right now. This is exactly the kind of thing that we really love to hear about and then experience, and hopefully, a lot of us will end up owning these things and being able to invite friends over and have these great experiences in our personal home theaters. Like I said, if anybody wants to see this technology, it'll be at Cedia. It'll be moving out into lots of dealers across the whole world over time. So there'll be a chance. John, again, thank you.
You're certainly welcome.
All right, everybody out there, thanks for watching. Remember, like, share, subscribe, ring the buttons, put in comments, tell your friends, and I'll see you in the next video.